Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Hey, Kate.
Well, it's another block here, another session. How are you doing, Fahrusha?
I'm doing pretty well,
Good.
and I'm enjoying this slightly cooler weather. What I'm going to do right away is slate and say that here we are, and it is September 27th, 2016, and we have a fabulous show for you today, something extremely interesting. Yes. And I'm going to introduce our guest in 1 minute, but I do want to remind our listeners that we have 2 more weeks left before we make our choices on the contestant winners of the three book sets of books by Lisette Larkins. And so please keep those comments coming in on both shatteredrealitypodcast.com and shatteredrealitypodcast.wordpress.com, our mirror site. And now we have a fabulous guest, and I'm going to tell you why he's fabulous before I actually introduce him. The reason why he's going to be extremely interesting is that there is no one who can fail to be interested by this subject. This is a subject that affects each and every one of us. It doesn't only affect people who have dreams or people who are psychic or people who want to do remote viewing. This subject affects each and every one of us. Our guest today is Mr. Robert Hastings. He has a book called UFOs and Nukes, Extraordinary Encounters at Nuclear Weapons Sites. And now he has a brand new movie called UFOs and Nukes, The Secret Link Revealed. This is a new documentary film by Robert Hastings, and it is extremely well documented with U.S. Air Force, FBI, and CIA files that have been declassified. Now, Robert Hastings has degrees in photography and material science. He was born at Sandia Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1950, and he actually lived at Maelstrom Air Force Base in Montana. His father was a career military officer. So, Kate, let's welcome Robert Hastings.
Robert, great to talk to you again. And I think the most...
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I think one of the most important things that Fahrusha said was that the film is indeed a documentary. This is not fiction. This is not made up. Boy, you have just gone to extreme lengths to document and just prove your case in this one, which is indeed incursions of UFOs over nuclear bases, not just in this country, but in other countries as well.
My father, as you mentioned, was at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1966-67. He was a senior master sergeant, but not an officer. But indeed, that was the genesis of my interest in the subject of UFOs and nukes. Long story short, he worked in a large windowless concrete structure called the Sage Building, which had military radar operations. And in March of 67, he was aware from scuttlebutt around the Sage Building that unknown aerial objects were being tracked on multiple radars at Malmstrom Air Force Base. Most alarmingly, these objects were flying near the nuclear missile sites. And he was only indirectly involved, but there were enough rumors floating around that he knew that much. At the same time, I was a junior in high school, but I worked as a janitor 3 nights a week at the base air traffic control tower. Just pushed a broom, emptied trash cans, and so on.
Great.
And over the course of several months, I made the acquaintance of an FAA controller, actually a supervisor named Bob Grasser. And he was quite generous with his time when he was in the break room explaining to me how radar worked and so on. And one night, as best as we can determine, mid to late March of 67, I walked into RAPCON, Radar Approach and Control, where he worked at the top of the tower. and was going to empty trash cans and move on. And he just nonchalantly, as I recall, motioned me over to a scope and said, "We're tracking 5." And he either used the term unknowns, which is the proper term, radar term, or he may have actually said UFOs. But I knew what he was talking about, and that was why I got interested in this topic. I went home very excited, told my father that the tower is tracking UFOs, and unbeknownst to me, he made some inquiries around the Sage building and found out that indeed the military radar personnel were tracking them too. And I was a teenager. I couldn't really do much with that information. But when I graduated from college in 1972 and did a year's worth of graduate work, around that time frame, I became aware of published references. The late Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was the Blue Book scientific advisor, Project Blue Book, he made mention of UFO activity near nuclear missile sites in North Dakota. Ray Fowler, who is a well-known UFO researcher, wrote a book in 1974 called UFOs, Interplanetary Visitors, in which he said that his liaison personnel at Malmstrom, he was in the Minuteman program for Sylvania Corporation, but his contacts at the base were confirming that UFOs were hovering over the missiles and the missiles were malfunctioning. At that point, I went, wow, this is real. This is important. We need to get these veterans on the record. And so I began seeking out persons who were involved in these incidents, not only at Malmstrom, but elsewhere, involving UFO incursions at nuclear missile sites. I now have over 150 sources, ranging from the rank of colonel down to airman, persons who were where the UFOs hovered over missile sites, over bomb storage depots, at nuclear missile test sites, just the whole spectrum of UFO incursions at nuclear weapon sites. And by 1981, I felt, I don't know why I'm so driven to do this, but I quit a good paying job and I went out on the college lecture circuit to try to acquaint Americans with the reality of the situation. And that was 30 some years ago. I've spoken at over 500 colleges and universities.
Wow.
I am finding a very receptive audience, not only in this country, but now that the internet is in existence, I have contacts worldwide. People are very obviously interested in the subject.
Yes, and I can absolutely see why. And Kate and I certainly understand why you're doing what you're doing, because here we are making a podcast, a totally non-commercial podcast, totally free access, for which we get paid absolutely nothing, and we continue to do it because these are subjects, this subject and allied subjects are things that we think people need to pay more attention to in the world, and they're not paying enough attention to. But to get back to you and the first example that I think you talk about is the Roswell connection, and how this was a dawn of a different era with the advent of nuclear weapons being tested in places, and Roswell. Tell us why Roswell is important, please.
Well, of all the Roswell witnesses, in my view, the most important is a man named General Arthur Exxon, and he was a lieutenant colonel at Wright Field, later Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, in July of 47 when this incident occurred down in New Mexico. Lieutenant Colonel Exxon was later General Exxon. He was the base commander of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the early 60s, quite an unimpeachable source. And he has gone on the record with Kevin Randall, researcher Kevin Randall, saying that he was there when the debris from the Roswell craft came in and was analyzed by engineers at Wright-Patterson. And he said a couple of the people involved thought this might be advanced Soviet technology based on captured German technology at the end of the war. But he said the majority of the analysts were pretty sure that this debris was from an interplanetary craft. And he has said on the record, on audio tape and in written letters, that after 24 hours of analysis of this debris, everyone from President Truman on down knew that we had recovered an interplanetary spacecraft. Now, the importance of the Roswell incident to the nuclear weapons-related cases is that at the time of the incident, the Roswell Army Airfield was the only base on the planet that had nuclear-capable bombers. The 509th Bomb Group, which was the same bomb group that that the Japanese cities experienced in World War II. They bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were involved in some tests immediately after World War II in the South Pacific. And literally at the time of the Roswell incident, which General Exxon says the recovery of an alien spacecraft, the nearby facility where all this took place was the only nuclear bomber base in the world at that time. In my view, that's not coincidental. I think whoever were aboard this craft were involved in some sort of surveillance of the operations at Roswell.
That's also when the whole veil of secrecy over UFOs started to really come into effect, too. That was part of Roswell as well, all the cover-ups that the government, just enforced on the public.
Yes, indeed. Now,
let me just, I think, Robert, really, certainly no one disagrees that nuclear plants have attracted UFOs, but I think what a lot of people don't understand is the size of these, these flying vehicles, these unidentified flying vehicles. They're huge. I mean, they're really scary, and they're fiery red, and they're hanging there, and there's just no communication with them. It's sort of an odd sort of an object.
They're clearly not conventional aircraft.
Right.
The majority of the witnesses that I've spoken with, primarily nuclear weapons security guards at various Air Force bases. They're the ones who would be above ground level, who would see something in the sky. The vast majority of my sources have said that these were saucer-shaped, probably 30 to 50 feet in diameter, brightly glowing if they're seen at night. If they're seen in the day, they're silver metallic discs. There are a handful of cases where what are being described are much larger objects, like cylinder-shaped objects, perhaps the size of an aircraft carrier or even larger. And there are even cases where small discs have been observed coming out of these larger cylinder-shaped objects, as if they're motherships, so to speak. But the witnesses, what I've told people now for 3 decades, both on the college lecture circuit, my audiences, and just when I do interviews like this, all of the people that I've talked to over the years are entrusted by the U.S. government to either guard or operate nuclear weapons. They were thoroughly vetted. They're not flakes. They're not psychologically unstable. They don't drink. They don't have drug problems. They're this thoroughly vetted. And there's a system in place that keeps them very in check when they're not only doing their jobs, but in their off-duty hours. And yet now I have over 150 launch officers, targeting officers, missile maintenance personnel, missile security guards, all saying that UFOs have monitored and even tampered with our nuclear missiles or weapons in general. I just think the public really needs to realize that there are this many credible people all saying that this has taken place. Even though at the end of the Cold War, we and the Russians downsized our nuclear arsenals, we by treaty still have plenty of weapons, over 1,000 deployed missiles, for example, in each country, not let alone the stockpiles that would more than, adequately destroy human civilization if we ever blunder into a nuclear war. So even though nuclear weapons are not, at this point in our history, as dire a situation as they were when we were threatening to go to war with the Soviets, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the potential for disaster still exists. And it's clear based on the reports that I've gotten even in the last 2 or 3 years from Malmstrom Air Force Base that UFOs are still monitoring our nuclear weapons. So this really is a subject that everyone has a vested interest in learning about.
absolutely.
What sort of scared me in the debate last night, which, without getting into any politics or anything, is that both participants agreed strongly that nuclear war, nuclear weapons were our major threat. And that surprised me. I mean, I was thinking, like all the other different political talking points would have come up. But they both were very much in agreement with that, which, I mean, obviously it's a serious problem and a real threat, but I was surprised that that was brought up. Has there been like an increase in nuclear observations or anything along those lines that would make that threat? That
Well, to follow
obvious?
up on your to follow up on your point, humans are fallible creatures. One just has to look at our history to know that even if we don't intentionally mean to do something, we'll sometimes blunder into things. And there have been so many in my book, which is available at my website, ufohastings.com. There's a whole chapter devoted to near misses where either we or the Russians almost launched World War III. And all of these dramatic incidents, these near misses, were kept classified until the late 1990s. The best well-known one is the most dramatic one was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. But there are over 20 cases that either our government or the Russian government has acknowledged as being where we were literally minutes away from nuclear destruction, and the vast majority of the American public and other people don't even know it to this day. To your second point, what is the frequency of sightings today? My research is based on catch as catch can. There's no way I can systematically get an idea of how many events took place in a given year at a given base, because quite clearly these are classified at a high level. Right. Most of my sources, these veterans wait years, sometimes decades, before they feel comfortable talking about what they were involved in. So something may have happened last night at one base or another. There could have been a UFO event at a missile site at Malmstrom or some other base, and it may be decades before I know about it, years certainly. But the last one that we can ascertain occurred with no doubt was in October of 2010 at F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, and it was, coincidentally or not, only a month after my press conference, which was, by the way, 6 years ago today, 27th of September 2010. So that's kind of coincidental. Not even a month later, on October 23rd, the F.E. Warren Air Force Base suddenly could not communicate with 5 of the missile launch control capsules, each of which controlled 10 nuclear missiles. So suddenly, for reasons that were inexplicable initially, the base could not communicate with 50 officers that would have launched 50 missiles. Now, when I heard that, the story broke in the Atlantic, by the way, the Atlantic website, and the Pentagon had to admit that what they claimed was a 1-hour situation where they couldn't communicate with these capsules. What I learned by contacting my sources at the base, both active duty military and retired, was that the incident actually lasted 25 hours, something the Pentagon did not want to admit, that they were having trouble communicating with these launch capsules for more than a day. But what they also obviously did not want to admit, what my sources told me, missile maintenance technicians, was that during this day-long incident, there were various maintenance teams out in the field trying to ascertain the problem and bring the missiles back online, affect the communications with the base. And all these teams independently went back to the base and reported seeing a huge cylinder-shaped object gliding through the sky. And one of the sources said that it was pretty clear shortly thereafter that this was not a blimp or something, because the maintenance commander at the base got the entire squadron in a room and said, "You will not discuss with journalists or researchers or anyone what you, quote, may or may not have seen in the sky." So quite clearly, the high-level Air Force personnel at F.E. Warren knew that this was a UFO incident, or at least the UFO was sighted at the same time they were having problems communicating with the missile crews. Quite clearly, in my view, the two were related, and that's roughly 6 years ago that this occurred. So it's still ongoing. It's not ancient history. It didn't go away at the end of the Cold War.
Now, moving away from what just happened, I want to just kind of give our listeners a general idea of the typical incursion that might occur at one of these air bases that have these missile silos in them. There are, tell me if I'm wrong, there are generally 2 layers to this. There are the guys underneath the ground in front of the screens and in charge of the missile silos. And then there are another group of airmen that are above ground who are watching the missile silos, and they're doing things above ground. And generally, these two groups operate somewhat separately, and what happens to them during these incursions are somewhat different. In the typical incursion, the UFO comes over, the fellows up top see the UFO. The UFO may or may not seem to shoot down a beam of light that goes into the area where the missiles are stored, and then the gentlemen downstairs find that the missiles have gone offline. Is that generally the way that these things work? I mean, not all of them. Obviously, there's aberrant and different ones, but is that kind of generally the way the scenario takes place?
It is. And the co-sponsor of my press conference, which CNN streamed live, by the way, if one goes to my homepage, again, ufohastings.com, one can look at the, I think it's about 75-minute long press conference that CNN streamed where veterans were talking about these kinds of incidents. The one that is most publicized that is representative by Robert Salas, who was a former Air Force captain, a nuclear missile launch officer who was at Malmstrom the same time my father was there in 1967. For almost 20 years now, he has publicly been speaking about his experience. He was one of the launch officers, 50 feet, 60 feet underground in the launch capsule. Another officer named Fred Mywald, who retired as an Air Force colonel, was with him. Mywald was on rest break. They're down there for like 24 hours, so they take turns sleeping. Salas was at the launch console. Mywald was sleeping. Salas gets a call from a security guard saying, "We're seeing a strange object doing zigzag maneuvers in the sky." Salas didn't know what to make of this. He said, "Well, if anything else develops, let me know." And he said about 5 minutes later, he got another call from the security guard's topside, screaming into the phone that this round, glowing orange object had now hovered, suddenly approached the launch control capsule, was hovering directly over the front gate to the site, and was just scaring the hell out of the guards. One guard apparently was so panicked that he dropped his weapon and tried to climb the barbed wire fence to get out, thereby injuring himself. That's how panic-stricken he was. And Salas said, while he's taking all this reporting over the phone, as he's looking at his launch consoles, one after the other, the 10 missiles that he controlled dropped off alert status, meaning they malfunctioned in some manner and could not be launched. Shortly thereafter, the guard screams, the object's left. And I'm going to go take care of the injured airman. So that's, Salas has meanwhile woken up Mywald. They get an indication, an alarm at one of the other missiles. They're at a centrally located facility underground. Scattered around them in the countryside are 10 different silos with missiles in them. They get an alarm indication after this object has left. They sent out two men, what was called a security alert team, and a Jeep. Actually, not a Jeep, but like a crew cab vehicle, a pickup truck kind of vehicle. And Salas said, and Mywald has confirmed this, I've interviewed him, that when they got out to the missile silo, they saw either the same or a different UFO hovering directly over that silo, some 10 miles distant from where the launch control capsule was. They were so freaked out, these two guards, that they immediately raced back to the launch control capsule. And on the way, there was radio interference, which is quite common for UFO reports. They could not communicate, but Salas and Mywald have said when they got back to the main facility, they were just, nervous wrecks. One of them could not even keep his composure to the point that he could do his work. They had to send him back early to the base hospital for psychiatric treatment. He was just, had a nervous breakdown. Apparently, he was so terrified. Now, the interesting thing, this was at Oscar flight. We pinned down the date. Long story short, from other sources, we know that occurred on the evening of March 24th, 1967, and continued on into the early hours of March 25th. Fortunately, another Air Force officer who was a targeting officer named Robert Jameson has also gone on the record. He spoke at my press conference. You can see his testimony in the at my website from the CNN covered interview, streamed interview. Jameson confirmed all of this. He said he was on call. He got a report that there was a problem out at Oscar Flight. He went down to the missile maintenance hangar at the base and was told that a UFO had shut down all 10 of the nuclear missiles associated with Oscar Flight. And, he didn't, you can imagine he's going, what happened, but then sure enough, there was what he called the special briefing right before the crews left for the site way out in the Montana countryside. They were told formally that UFOs had been, quote, messing with the missiles, and that they had to go back and out there and bring them back up. The exact nature of the problem seemed to be what was called guidance and control failure. Part of the guidance system to the missile and all 10 missiles had been screwed with, and somehow the UFO, in this case, no one saw a beam come down onto the missiles, but there clearly was an association with the UFO being in the vicinity and all the missiles simultaneously having these guidance and control problems.
Wow.
So that's, that I guess I should conclude by saying that Salas said that he and Mywald were rushed back to the base. They were debriefed by what's called an OSI, Office of Special Investigations agent, were sworn to secrecy. They had to sign what are called national security non-disclosure statements, saying that they couldn't even talk about this among themselves. And, Salas kept his silence for 3 decades. He finally, in the mid-90s, felt that, as I feel, the public has a right to know the facts, and he began speaking about this publicly.
Had he any repercussions from that?
None of the people that I've talked to, including Salas, have ever had any legal problems. The FBI has not shown up at their door. What I think is going on is the Pentagon is thinking probably that if they lean on these guys who are willing to come out and speak to CNN about all of this, if they suddenly start harassing these veterans, these guys are likely just to go to the New York Times or, Washington Post and say, I was involved in this incident and now the FBI or the Air Force is threatening me. And that's just more unwanted publicity. So again, of all the people, 150 plus at this point, whom I've interviewed since 1973, not one of them has ever said to me, after I talked to you, I was threatened by the government. So the active duty guys, that's a different story. I have made it a point not to talk to active duty military personnel because I don't want to impact their careers negatively. If their commanders or someone else becomes aware of me talking to them and so on. So, but as far as the veterans, the Pentagon and the intelligence community just seem to leave these guys alone.
I think also that the fact that you report these airmen being terrified, it's one thing to talk about this or read about it, but it's something else to see a representation of this. Like in your movie, this is Robert Hastings that we're speaking to, and the movie was just really excellent. I mean, I think I like it because it's not very sensational at all. It's just like, these are the
Straight
facts,
out.
boom, boom, documentary, perfect documentary.
Go
ahead.
UFOs and Nukes, The Secret Link Revealed. This is the name of the documentary film available on Vimeo. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Kate.
no, I was going to say, by Robert Hastings.
Yes.
Over the
really
years,
a pleasure.
I've gotten thousands of contacts, especially now that people have email. I mean, prior to email, I would get handwritten letters from people all over the world, actually, saying why I like you. What you do is that you're not sensationalistic. You don't make claims that you can't verify. You have credible witnesses. You have documents to back up what you're saying. And it's clear that this is all based in factual reality. It's not speculative. It's not, fanciful and so on. So, yes, my film in 2012, I was contacted by a man named Jared Tarbell, who is one of the co-founders of the Etsy website, Etsy.com.
Yes, very familiar.
And Fortunately, he read my book. He was a UFO skeptic. I turned him around completely. I mean, he was blown away by the book, and he said, I'm I'm well-to-do. I have a lot of money. Can I help you? And I said, well, I've never really taken money from people before. And he basically wrote back and said, listen, fool, I am a millionaire. You're probably not. Why don't you let me help you? And so, long story short, he ended up eventually shelling out $150,000 to make this documentary film. Anyone who's not made a film, you would not believe how expensive this type of production can become very quickly.
Uh-huh.
In any case, the film is 48 minutes long. It is available, again, at Vimeo.com. You just search for UFOs and Nukes. The feedback has been overwhelmingly favorable. In just the 2 or 3 months that it's been available, it's generated, in terms of the responses I've gotten via email, over 1,000 responses, 2 or 3 of which were critical. The rest, people just were effusive in their praise because it is documented. It's not sensationalistic. And what many, many people have commented on is the fact that you can see these veterans on camera discussing at length the incidents they were involved in. You don't have to just read their testimony in an article or in my book. It seems to have an extra dimension of impact to see these guys who are all in their 70s and 80s very articulately speaking about when the UFO shut down their missiles and how they were told never to talk about it. It's quite, it has quite a bit of impact.
Well, for each one of these 150 gentlemen who have come out and told you these things, there are probably at least 10 others who have not. Would you suspect that?
That's it. And at the end of the program, at the end of the film, I ask veterans to contact me. I even have my website on the screen so people can read it. I have always tried to generate new sources to further strengthen the argument that this is real and ongoing. I'm aware of incidents just even in the last 5 years, other than the one that I mentioned at F.E. Warren Air Force Base, where UFO activity at either missile sites or nuclear warhead storage depots or bomb storage depots, it's ongoing. And, there are veterans now, security policemen and others, who were with the Air Force for 4 years. They're now out. They're in their late 20s or early 30s, and they're contacting me with some amazing stories. Unlike the older guys, all of whom were involved in incidents in the 60s and 70s, and they're now retired, these younger guys are a little more reluctant to come forward because they still have careers, they have jobs, and they're just afraid that, by saying that, UFOs are messing with our nukes is somehow going to come back to haunt them in terms of their professional careers. So they're a little more reluctant. One of my goals is hopefully within 5 years to get some of these younger veterans willing to go again back to Washington to the National Press Club and have a repeat of my press conference, but with younger veterans describing incidents that have taken place just in the last 10 years. The point I make again and again is this did not go away decades ago, at the end of the Cold War. We still have nukes. The Russians have nukes. The North Koreans have nukes. The UFOs are still very interested in the nuclear weapons situation. And I just think, I guess, to my last dying day, that this is something that should not be hidden from the public, not only Americans, but people everywhere.
Have you at all looked into the biggest nuclear disaster of our time that keeps unfolding, which is the Fukushima meltdown, the whole thing that happened there in Japan and still continues to generate thousands of gallons of nuclear waste every day and is poisoning the ocean and probably killing a whole bunch of Japanese people at the same time, as well as people on the islands and moving over to the west coast of the United States. Has there been any UFO sightings, incursions, anything involving that you know of?
There have been. You asked whether I've looked into it. I really have not investigated it per se. because of other factors. I don't speak Japanese. Having good communications with people that might have information about that, it would be a little difficult for me to really get some credible sources and go through the translation process, among other factors. However, shortly after it occurred, I'm aware of some hoaxes that appeared on the internet where people allege that they had caught videos of UFOs above Fukushima. Every one of those that I saw early on after the accident in 2011 were fraudulent. They were clearly other objects than bona fide UFOs. So I became a little disenchanted with the whole Fukushima thing. However, not even a year ago, I believe it was, I was presented with a couple of security camera films taken at the Fukushima plant. You can see it in the foreground in the field of the view of the cameras, in which there are, on these two films, objects moving in the sky that clearly are not conventional aircraft. So I think there are some legitimate tapes out there, some videos that would suggest a UFO presence at this site. And based on everything I know about the situation going back decades, this would not surprise me in the least. In my book, I briefly discussed the fact that shortly after the Chernobyl reactor in Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, exploded in April 1986. Apparently, there were Soviet radiation monitoring teams on site who observed what was described as a brass-colored sphere hovering directly above the damaged reactor just a few hours after it exploded. And these people were there monitoring the ambient radiation. The reports that later appeared in the Soviet, actually Russian by that point, Russian media and Ukrainian media named one of these Soviet radiation team members. He described seeing the sphere that hovered above the plant, sending down what he called two crimson-colored beams of light into the reactor, right into the damaged pile. And he estimated for some 3 to 5 minutes, this thing hovered above the site. It raced away. He said there were hundreds of witnesses. And the most dramatic revelation was that based on their readings of the ambient radiation in the air when they first got there, when this object left, according to this source mentioned both in the Soviet or Russian again and Ukrainian press, he said that the ambient radiation level had dropped by 2/3.
Wow.
And when they next measured it in the air, seemingly the suggestion was that whatever this UFO did with these beams of light, somehow it had lowered the radiation level. Did those beams somehow coat the pile with like lead, which would have made it less radioactive? The radiation can't get through lead, or who knows what went on. But all of this was described in a very cogent, convincing fashion. So I would not be surprised if whoever are flying these craft would take an immediate and ongoing interest in Fukushima.
Well, it strikes me, too, when you go back to the 60s, the technology, the computers of that era were obviously, in today's world, very rudimentary. And so it was always amazing that they could be shut down. And yet, with wireless technology, which I'm pretty sure is available to a UFO, that's obviously what they did. And as the technology, has the technology increased with these ICBMs, or are they sort of forced into keeping the same type because they'd have to change absolutely everything over?
My understanding, talking to the veterans, is that the systems have progressed, the hardware and the missiles themselves, but it seems like the infrastructure, for example, the telephone systems down in the launch control capsules, they're still being run by floppy disks.
Yeah.
And, there's some current outcry about, if we're going to have these nukes, we really need to upgrade the support systems. But one of the veterans, Bruce Fenstermacher, who was involved in an incident at F.E. Warren, I mentioned it in my film. He was a launch officer, got a report of this huge cigar-shaped object hovering over his launch control capsule, and got these extended reports from the guards. He ordered them out to chase this thing. It was moving from missile to missile. He later learned that they were so terrified they kept making up excuses as to why they could not go out there. But I mentioned that he talks in the film about what happened there and being sworn to secrecy and so on. But he told me that by the time the mid-'70s came around, when he was in the Air Force, there were some efforts to further shield the systems from external radio, electromagnetic pulses, rather, which they think the best analysis is that somehow an EMP or electromagnetic pulse was injected directly into the cables that connected all the missiles up at Malmstrom when they went down. And former Captain Fenstermacher was saying that he was aware the Air Force was upgrading security in terms of shielding the cables so they would be more resistant to electromagnetic pulse. And based on what I know about the situation, I suspect those actions were a direct result to the Air Force knowing that the UFOs had used EMP to shut down the missiles some 10 years earlier up at Malmstrom. But, it's just the other thing, if one has sort of a passing interest in this or has read about this on the internet at one website or another, the sense is that maybe there were one or two incidents. It's clear there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of these incidents since the late 40s of UFOs hovering over and even tampering with American nuclear weapons. It's just rampant, and again,
Russian ones too. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
and Russia. Yeah, there's an investigative television reporter named George Knapp. Many of your listeners will have heard of George Knapp. He was involved, for example, in bringing forward Bob Lazar, who made claims about his work on an alien craft at S4. That aside, whatever the merits of those claims, George Knapp was in Russia shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, interviewing former Soviet Army personnel, one of whom, Boris Sokolov, who was a retired colonel, had in his possession some still top-secret documents about UFO incursions at Soviet missile sites. And amazingly, and with Colonel Sokolov's cooperation, in effect, or approval, George Knapp smuggled these several 100 pages of secret documents about these nuclear missile cases in Russia to the West. And I presented two of them in my film where they're describing, in one case, a UFO sending down a laser-like beam onto a nuclear warhead storage depot, missile warhead storage depot. And there were hundreds of witnesses at this base called Kapustin Yar that witnessed this domed disc hovering above the nuclear depot and sending down this beam directly onto the roof of the building. Another case in 1982 in Soviet Ukraine where a huge disc-shaped craft hovered above a intermediate range nuclear missile site in Soviet Ukraine. And for 15 seconds, while this object was hovering above the missile base, the missiles, some unspecified number of missiles, went into countdown mode. They were preparing to launch.
That was the best story, the best out of all of this. My God, 15 seconds countdown?
For 15 seconds, the missile security people, one of the witnesses said that they looked like old men. He said their hair turned gray, clearly trying to explain how terrified they were.
From one of the stories about that too, the one guy was so terrified he didn't know what to do. He actually pulled the plugs out of the wall, tried to disconnect everything. I don't. That's probably just hearsay, but what a terrifying situation.
I've not heard that, but I do know that they had no control over this countdown. As I mentioned in my film, one of my veterans who I show in the film, David Shore, he was formerly a captain in the Air Force, a nuclear missile launch officer at Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota in the 60s. He described a similar incident first to me on audio tape in my book and then later in the film, saying that he got a call from his top guard from ground levels down to the capsule saying, we're looking at this bright disc-shaped object moving from missile to missile to missile. And Captain Shore said that when the guard said it was over E4, suddenly E4 down on his console would light up and was clearly going into countdown mode, was in launch mode. And Shore said that they would flip what's called an inhibit switch And then the guard would say it's now moved on to E6, and suddenly down in the capsule, a light denoting E6 would move on, or would go on, indicating that that missile was now in countdown mode. Just very terrifying stuff. And, Shore said that he thinks out of the 10 missiles that he controlled, probably 8 of them had this problem. And in each case, they had to flip this inhibit switch because, to all indications, these missiles were preparing to launch. If they had, of course, it would have been World War III.
Oh, boy.
What I say in my film is I don't think those aboard the UFO, either in Russia or America, were trying to start a war, but what they were probably doing was activating the launch sequence to try to learn how it worked electronically. And so, if in fact it ever came to the point where we were going to launch nuclear war, or the Russians were, whoever these people are in these craft, they would have the ability to interfere with the launch sequences. That's my hypothesis.
That brings me to a two-part question. The first part is, it seems as though, aside from the people in the capsules when the missiles seemed like that they were going to launch, aside from that form of terror, that the topside fellows, they seem to have had a lot of terror going on just from having seen the UFOs. And they experienced such things as, like you said, the gentleman trying to climb out of the base, and also in one of your film clips, there was a fellow that went into a fetal position and could not be coaxed out of it for some amount of time. Now, there is some form of a directive that we have heard about that people have done a study that said that the entire fabric of society would fray and perhaps collapse if it were revealed that UFOs were visiting the Earth. And there's been a lot of argument to and fro amongst ufologists as to whether this would actually happen. And what is your opinion, having spoken to some of these fellows who've seen these UFOs and in fact panicked?
Well, don't forget too. I mean, these they weren't seeing in the middle of a city with everyone hovering around saying, "Yeah, what's that?" I mean, they're out in the middle of nowhere, God's own country, and it's pitch dark. And
well, this happens a lot to people out in the middle of nowhere. Apparently,
I know. They've got some stupid little pop gun of a rifle out there, and then this huge thing comes over their head and shoots down beams of light, and missiles are going off. Yeah, they're scared. What are they, 18, 19 years old?
Well, but I mean,
exactly.
Wouldn't it change
I
society?
Understand your point.
Yeah.
Actually, in my book, I mentioned, for example, in 1959, the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank, did a study for NASA. There was another study by the RAND Corporation, which is a think tank for the Air Force, in 1968. Both of those are declassified. In both cases, I should say, the analysts at these think tanks told NASA and the Air Force that there was potential for public panic. Human systems such as the economic system could collapse. Suppose some president gets on TV and says that beings from another world are here. A large number of people might take their stocks out of the stock market, bury their money in their backyard till they see what happened. That kind of thing, where you suddenly have an unsettled economic situation, people wondering, what's going to happen next, and buying gold and silver and all the rest of it. But the Brookings Institute analysts said, human religions could be impacted. Suppose our visitors decide at some point to share their knowledge of the universe with us and their concept of God. It may almost certainly conflict with human beliefs, or in my view, it would almost certainly conflict with human beliefs about the deity, whatever we conceive God to be, et cetera. So there were all these potential dire consequences that both of these think tanks were laying out, categorizing for, the Air Force and NASA, saying, if this, it does prove to be, if UFOs prove to be visitors from elsewhere, you really want to think twice about going public with it. Victor Marchetti, I've mentioned at my website in more than one article. Victor Marchetti is a former high-level CIA official. He left the agency in the late 60s because it was engaged in all sorts of illegal and immoral activities, and wrote a bestseller, an expose on the agency called The CIA and Cult of Intelligence. The CIA took him all the way to the Supreme Court to try to prevent that being published. And in any case, in May of 1979, Victor Marchetti wrote an article called How the CIA Views the UFO Phenomenon. It's available online, but it's very hard to get a hold of. But if any of your listeners can't find it and they want to write me on my website, I'll send them a link to it or send them a Word document with this article.
Maybe we should put a link to it on your what we're going to write up about you for the website, so it's right there.
You being Robert Hastings.
You being Robert Hastings, yes.
Yes.
So in Robert Hastings,
I can do that.
You can just send me the link, and I will put it up as soon as the podcast is ready for publication. It will be up along with all your information. I'm sure that a lot of people will want to look at that, and there it is.
What I was going to say was Victor Marchetti said that when he was at CIA, there were rumors. He said that UFOs were such a sensitive topic that you did not talk about it unless you had, some reason to. He said, nevertheless, humans being humans, there would be like water cooler talk. There would be rumors swirling. And he said there were rumors about multiple UFOs crashing, some of which were shot down by military aircraft. He said there were rumors at CIA's about what he called bodies of little gray men on ice at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But then he devotes most of this article saying that if the CIA knows that UFOs are visitors from elsewhere, what they're probably advising every administration, that comes into office is do not talk about this, do not go public because the consequences are unpredictable. And Marchetti is saying, if you're in power, if you're in charge of the government or part of the status quo, the economic, movers and shakers of any given country, if you know that aliens are here and your public might respond not too well if they were told the truth, then you really could, your power base could be in jeopardy, your control of your own citizens could be in jeopardy. And so Marchetti was saying, as an intelligence analyst, his view is that intelligence agencies in every country who's in on the UFO secret are advising their governments never to go public with this, just to wait and wait and wait and see what happens.
Well, I don't have a dog in this race, but do you believe, or do you have some evidence that these vehicles are actually extraterrestrial, that they're not from a different time or a different
I think there may very well be a different civilization on this planet as well. It's been here for a long time and is protecting itself by limiting nukes.
Go ahead.
I refer to these guys as, quote, visitors from elsewhere. And I think it would be presumptuous for me to say they're extraterrestrials, they're interdimensional beings, they're time travelers. What I've actually told people in many of these radio interviews over the years is all of the above, and our multiple choice test.
Right.
D is always all of the above. And that's what I think is going on. It's such a fantastically large and complex universe. Why couldn't we have beings traveling within space-time, which is our universe, from other worlds? Why couldn't we have other dimensions? Most physicists now say there are higher dimensions of space other than our universe. Why couldn't some of these beings, if not from some other dimension, at least utilize that dimension to travel from their world to ours? But some of them, if humans do have a future and evolve in the future, why can't some of these incidents involve humans from the future coming back? So I say all of the above.
Okay.
I think it's arrogant. It's arrogant for any of us to, any one of us to say that the data point to one thing or another. I think it's very complex.
And yet most people feel it obvious that if and when we go to Mars, which I think will be in the next decade or 2 or 3, we will be UFOs to Martians. And everyone goes, oh, yeah,
Exactly.
okay. But no one thinks that UFOs are here. I mean, just for us to do it, it's okay, but nobody can come here and do it.
Well,
And
I
it's
think
sort
that
of a twist in that mindset.
more and more people have been enculturated to the idea
Yeah,
that
I do too.
UFOs can be here because of the media has enculturated them to that. Point one. Point two being that if somebody's coming from the Pleiades, they're not coming using a chemical rocket. They're coming
Right.
doing something else, which might be
knows?
quote unquote interdimensional. So certainly that between interdimensional and interstellar, there could be clearly a cross going on there. But like you, I do not know. I do not pretend to know the answer.
The other thing too is I think we got away a long way away from those scare films of the 50s, when the saucer would come down with a woo 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 sound, and someone would get nabbed in the neck by some creature. And those things sort of went the way of whatever. I mean, they're sort of funny now, but I don't.
Independence Day.
What I tell
Mars
my
attacks.
lecture audiences. What I tell my lecture audiences at colleges and universities is, you have to consider all the possibilities. If anyone in the Pentagon or anyone in the Kremlin knows what's going on, I certainly don't know. So these incidents involving the nuclear missile shutdowns, is it some race or multiple races trying to warn us that we're playing with fire? They're slapping our hands, in effect, saying, think twice about using nukes. Is it that? Or if they've been here for thousands of years, do they have projects here? Do they have underground bases that would be impacted by a human nuclear war, and they don't want those types of disruptions? So in effect, what they're doing is in their own vested interest, or is it a combination of the two? And then I tell my audience, if we're looking at all the options, we really need to consider that one or more of these races might be hostile. They might need this world for some reason or have nefarious designs on humankind. And we really can't rule out that they're not shutting down the nukes because they want to inherit the earth and they don't want to have a radioactive wasteland. So, again, I'm the person on the planet. It's just unbelievable for me to say this out loud because it sounds ridiculous, but of all the human race, I'm the only fool that really devoted his life to studying all of this in great detail, the detail involving the nuclear weapons cases. And so I think as the primary researcher of this now very well-documented phenomenon, one only has to go to my website's document page, ufohastings.com/documents, and read all of the documents that are there to know that this is real and ongoing. And I myself cannot say, what this all represents. It's clearly going on, but the motivation behind it, the end game, and so on, I really think no one really knows.
Well, we don't think that you are a fool, that's for sure. Kate and I have a very high regard for you, and we're very appreciative for all the work you've put in. We're almost out of time here, but if you mentioned a little bit about your ongoing projects. Is there anything else you'd like to say about that, about what you're doing out there now?
I'm actively seeking new sources. So any of your listeners who are ex-military and have a knowledge of an incident, I would very much like to talk to you. My contact information is at my website. No one, as I said earlier, no one who's contacted me over 40 years has had any problems with being harassed. So don't worry about that. If you want to tell me something and have me keep it confidential, I'll do that. I'll honor your request, but I would certainly prefer to publish what you've said to add to the database so the public knows that this is widespread and ongoing. So I would encourage people to do that. Also, if you want to support my efforts by buying my book or watching my film at Vimeo, that would certainly be appreciated. UFO researchers are not the richest people in the world, and I have bills to pay like everyone else. So if you think what I'm doing is worthwhile and deserves support, then perhaps you'll help me out by either buying the film or the book.
And the name of the book and the film? Rosanna.
Do you want me
Yeah.
to say it? Okay.
Yes, please. Yeah, let's give
all right.
good Mr. Hastings some.
UFOs and Nukes, The Secret Link Revealed, his new documentary film, and UFOs and Nukes, Extraordinary Encounters at Nuclear Weapon Sites is the name of Robert Hastings' book. And I just want to say that we are in complete support of you, and we encourage you to continue for as long as you are able, and you look still quite able-bodied.
Also,
Not good.
but a lot of people are just starting. For myself and Fahrusha, I guess we've been hacking around with you, Robert, for a long time in the UFO field, and sometimes it gets to be a little bit old hat. But there are people that are just starting and just really now getting interested in it. And so I would highly recommend your book to those people as opposed to some of the more sensationalist productions.
Well, thank you.
Yes,
Really.
there's too many CGI things out there
Yeah.
on the internet that are just
Yep,
ruining the
yep.
field.
I get very angry and certainly frustrated about the amount of noise that one has to deal with on the internet to get to the signal. The whole purpose of what I'm doing is to separate the signal from the noise. There is valid UFO data. This is real. This is not anything that man-made. And if you know where to look, you can be convinced of that by what's come out of government files and these military witnesses' testimony. But there's just so much crap out there that people really get frustrated wading through it. I should quickly mention that my book is sold exclusively at my website, ufohastings.com. Scalpers buy it for $24.95 and then resell it on Amazon for $100 sometimes. So don't fall into that trap. It's directly available from my website.
Well, thank you so very much.
Really.
And as we conclude this this podcast, we want to thank him, Mr. Hastings, Robert Hastings, deeply for being on the show. And Kate?
Yeah. Listen, I've been a fan of yours for a long time, and I was really glad to be at that conference. Just a really quick note. Were you there when Mike Gravel, he was the retired senator from Alaska, slipped and sort of a snide aside said to somebody, "Yeah, of course we have a Space Force." And that always stuck with me. I said, "What did he just say?" So so go look into that, Robert.
No, you're going to give him a job, Kate. I don't know. I think he's got a big job as it is.
I wasn't there. I never heard anyone say that.
Yeah. Oh no.
Yeah, so
no.
I don't.
Mike
I
Gravel.
prefer not to chime in. I prefer not to offer opinions about things that I don't know anything about. So
It's
I'll just let
interesting.
that pass.
It's
Okay.
interesting.
It is an interesting thing, as well as that hacker from England, that fellow who hacked in and saw the
Jerry McKinnon.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
that is a very interesting situation. But we're not going to go into that now. What we're going to say now, before we say goodbye, is that our next show is with an author who has spoken to a lot of quantum physicists on her radio show, and the author is Eva Herr, and she is going to talk to us about her conversations with remarkable men and women. And that will be our next podcast, God willing, we're all here. And also that our ongoing contest is still ongoing for at least the next 2 weeks until the beginning of October for winning the 3-set book from Lizette Larkins. So make a comment on shatteredrealitypodcast.com or shatteredrealitypodcast.wordpress.com, our mirror site, and make the comment on the Lizette Larkins show, because only comments on the Lizette Larkins show will be accepted for inclusion in this podcast. But let's not forget about the podcast that we're doing right now and finishing up.
Okay.
That's going to be up in a couple days. Okay. All righty. So for Shattered Reality.
I guess it's goodbye.
Okay. From
Shattered
Shattered Reality.
I always miss those kids.